The sky above Zyril Prime was the color of a bruised plum. It had been that way for 3 millennia, filtered through the planetary defense lattice that wrapped the homeworld in an impenetrable, shimmering shell. To the Zyrelians, that purple haze was the color of safety. It was the visual proof that they were the masters of their sector, shielded by a grid so advanced it could vaporize a stray asteroid or a hostile fleet with the same indifferent precision. It was the crown of an empire that had forgotten what it felt like to be vulnerable. Then the purple fractured. It did not tear with the violent flash of a standard hyperspace rupture. There was no thermal bloom to trigger the orbital sirens, no gravitational wave to rattle the windows of the spire cities. The fabric of local space simply parted, peeling back like dead skin to reveal the absolute, crushing black beneath. From that designated empty space they descended. They were not sleek. They possessed no aesthetic grace. They were massive, brutalist wedges of dark, unpolished metal, heavy command vessels so large their own localized gravity began to pull the lower atmosphere into spiraling, violet storm fronts. Hundreds of them, the Zyrelian automated defense platforms, the most sophisticated tracking hardware in the Orion Spur, remained perfectly still. The targeting arrays did not pivot. The plasma batteries did not charge. The silent human ships drifted downward, casting shadows large enough to swallow entire continents, completely ignored by the planet's own armor. The grid, designed by human architects and maintained by human hands for 1,000 years, looked up at its creators and saw nothing at all. What happened next? I wish I could say it ended there. Stay close because you'll want to hear how the silence of a single grain of sand can eventually swallow a civilization. The only sound in the grand chamber was the low, metallic hum of the atmospheric scrubbers. It was a rhythmic, soul-deadening noise that Vale had grown to loathe over the last 3 cycles. It was the sound of stagnant power, of air that had been inhaled and exhaled by the same 300 species for 12 millennia. Vale tapped his translation earpiece, the small device clicking against his copper-scaled skin. The ambient environmental mix in the chamber was a calculated insult disguised as a compromise. It was 75% nitrogen, 24% oxygen, with a heavy spike of argon and just enough carbon dioxide to prevent the mammalian delegates from hyperventilating. For a Vorenian like Vale, the argon felt like breathing liquid lead, and the oxygen levels were high enough to make his secondary optical ridges sting. He rubbed the side of his bioluminescent neck, waiting for the audio feed to clear, his skin flickering a dull, anxious amber. The Galactic Council had ruled for 12,000 years. It was a monument to order, an amphitheater of carved obsidian and projected light where 300 species dictated the flow of trillions of lives. Everything here was designed to remind a visitor of their insignificance. The ceiling was a projection of the entire galaxy, spinning in slow, mocking cycles. The walls were made of a stone that absorbed sound, ensuring that any voice not amplified by the central dais felt thin and frail. Power was not subtle here. Power was the architecture. Vale shifted his weight, his 4 legs aching. The gravity in the grand chamber was locked at a steady 1.2 G. It was a standard setting for the Zyrelians, who thrived in heavy environments, but it was a grueling physical tax for almost every other species in the room. It was an invisible leash, a constant reminder that to stand in the presence of the council was to carry the weight of their authority on your very bones. He watched the junior delegates from the outer rim, mostly soft-skinned mammals and brittle insectoids, struggling to keep their posture straight. Their breathing was ragged, their joints were swelling. The council called it atmospheric harmonization, but Vale knew it for what it was, a biological filter. If you couldn't survive the air and the weight of the chamber, you didn't deserve a seat in it. Prelate Morno occupied the center dais. As a Zyrelian, he possessed no fixed biology, existing as a swirling, dense mass of corrosive violet gas contained within a pressurized, geometric containment suit. To the other delegates, Morno was a ghost in a machine, a terrifyingly intelligent storm wrapped in gold-plated circuitry. When he spoke, the acoustic modulators in his suit projected a voice that didn't just carry. It vibrated through the floor plates, rattling the bones of anyone standing too close. The parameters of the expansion treaty were absolute, Morno's voice echoed, cold and heavily synthesized. The Terran mandate has exceeded its designated sectors. You have established unapproved mining operations in the Kalen Drift. You have bypassed the central economic hub. This displays a fundamental incompatibility with galactic governance. Vale kept his primary eyes on his datapad, recording the official minutes with a trembling stylus. As a junior scribe, his job was to be invisible, a recording ghost. But his secondary eyes, positioned on the sides of his head, tracked the human delegation, or rather, the single human who had been sent to represent 1 billion souls. Her name was Marisol. She had entered the chamber 10 minutes ago, walking down the central aisle with a stride that was entirely too confident for someone under 1-2G gravity. She didn't have the heavy, plodding gait of the other bipedal species. Her footsteps were light, sharp, and rhythmic. It was as if she were walking on Earth's own gravity, ignoring the physical demands of Xyrelian space. She sat in the lowest tier of the chamber, a seating position mathematically calculated by the Xyrelian sociologists to induce a sense of psychological submission. She sat in a chair that was slightly too small, under a spotlight that was slightly too bright. She did not look submitted. She sat back in her chair, her spine straight despite the crushing pull of the floor. Her posture was loose, almost bored. Her breathing was slow and measured, perfectly synchronized with the thin, argon-heavy air. She was the chief diplomatic envoy for Earth, yet she wore no ceremonial armor, no kinetic shielding, no glowing sigils of her high office. She wore a simple, dark, tailored suit that seemed to absorb the harsh lights of the chamber. Around her, the other delegates were whispering. The Thalassic Union was clicking its mandibles in a sign of predatory interest. The Cathari were rustling their feathers, sensing blood in the water. For centuries, the Council had handled problematic species with the same three-step process: economic strangulation, medical isolation, and eventual absorption. They had expected the humans to be no different. Therefore, Morneau continued, the violet gas churning violently within his helmet like a trapped hurricane, the Council authorizes immediate and total economic sanctions. Sector locks will be placed on all Terran trade routes. Medical supply corridors will be suspended pending a full audit of your biological stockpiles. Warp lane access will be restricted to core ward vessels only. It was a death sentence. Vale knew the logistics better than most. He had seen the spreadsheets, the shipping manifests, the caloric requirements of 100 human colonies. Without the agricultural imports from the Outer Rim, Earth's colonies would experience critical famine within 4 months. Without the medical synthetic corridors, their frontier worlds would succumb to indigenous pathogens in less than 6. It was a calculated, bloodless execution designed to force humanity back into a localized, manageable corner of the galaxy where they could be forgotten. The room held its breath. This was the moment of the plea. This was when the new species usually fell to their knees, begging for a staggered rollout of the sanctions or a reassessment of the mining data. "I've reviewed the numbers," Marisol said. Her voice wasn't loud, but the acoustic dampening of the walls seemed to fail against her. "The Kalan Drift was never part of your designated economic hub. It was an independent sector when our contractors built the relays there 80 years ago." Morneau's helmet sensors glowed a sharp, angry orange. "Independence is a legal fiction, Envoy. Access to the grid is provided by the Council. Therefore, the sector is under the Council's jurisdiction. If you find the terms of our hospitality unfavorable, you are welcome to provide your own infrastructure." It was a joke. No one provided their own infrastructure. The Council grid was the air the galaxy breathed. "We intend to," Marisol replied. She reached out and rested her fingertips on the Council badge sitting on the desk. It was a palm-sized disk of crystalline lattice, glowing with a soft, pulsating internal blue light. It was the physical manifestation of validation. It granted a voice in the chamber, a secure channel in the communication grid, and a recognized existence in the eyes of the old empires. Human soldiers had died in border skirmishes just to earn the right for their diplomats to hold that disk. It was a tether to civilization, a promise that they were no longer alone in the dark. "You do not speak, Envoy," Morneau stated. The containment suit leaned forward, the acoustic modulators amplifying a tone of distinct, mechanical amusement. "Do you comprehend the mathematics of your situation? You are a young species. You build adequate machinery, you maintain our lower-tier defense grids, you serve as the galaxy's janitors and mechanics, but you lack the fundamental scale of empire. You are a single grain of sand in our machine. Do not attempt to grind against the gears." Vale felt his own bioluminescence dim. a Vorenian involuntary fear response that turned his scales a sickly, bruised gray. The arrogance of the Zyrelian prelate was suffocating, a physical pressure that seemed to fill the room, but it was the human's complete lack of a fear response that made Vale's dorsal ridges lock tight. Marisol stood up. The movement was deliberate and smooth. At 1-2G, standing up rapidly required immense core strength and skeletal density. She did not brace her hands on the desk. She did not wobble. She simply uncoiled, her heavy leather boots planting firmly on the metal deck with a sound that seemed too loud for the sound-dampening stone. The translation matrix hummed, a tiny green light flickering as it waited for her vocal input. She picked up the crystalline badge. She looked at it for a long, quiet moment, the blue light reflecting in her dark eyes. It was a beautiful thing, a miracle of engineering that linked the thoughts of 1,000 worlds. Then she set it back down. Not in the operational slot. She placed it dead center on the polished black desk, completely disconnected from the terminal. "I came here to speak," Marisol said. Her voice was unamplified, yet it carried clearly through the massive, silent chamber, cutting through the argon-heavy air like a blade. "You chose not to listen. That was your last choice." Beneath the observation deck, something shifted. Marisol turned away from the central dais. She didn't wait for a rebuttal. She didn't wait for the vote to be finalized. A heavy thud, then another. Her boots hit the deck plates. The sound of a biped walking under high gravity. It was not a retreat. It was a dismissal. The sheer physical weight of her stride echoed off the obsidian walls, a rhythmic, solitary drumbeat that seemed to mock the grandeur of the room. She did not look back at Prelate Morno. She did not look at the 300 delegates representing the accumulated wisdom of the stars. She walked up the tiered aisle, her head held high, the heavy doors of the grand chamber parting automatically as her biological signature registered. Then the doors sealed shut behind her with a final, echoing boom. For 10 seconds, the grand chamber was perfectly, absolutely silent. The galaxy's masters sat in their high seats, stunned by the sheer audacity of a species that would walk away from the table. They had prepared for a fight. They had not prepared to be ignored. Morno's suit released a sharp, pressurized hiss of gas. "Let the record show the Terran envoy has forfeited their right to appeal. The sanctions are active. The isolation of Earth begins now." Vale's fingers danced across his datapad, his heart rate spiking as he tried to enter the final ruling into the central registry. He needed to close the file to finalize the digital shackles that would starve a world. The registry interface flickered. A line of red text scrolled across his secondary screen, then another. "Error. Node access RVOKD." He tapped the diagnostic key. The response lag was 0.4 seconds. Unacceptable. The Council communication grid operated on a zero-latency quantum entanglement network. Even a millisecond of delay was a sign of total system collapse. Vale routed his query through the secondary nodes in the Vorenian sector. Access DENIED, contractor override in effect. Vale's primary eyes widened, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks. He switched to the macroeconomic feed, intending to monitor the automated closure of the Terran trade routes. The holographic map of the Orion Spur materialized above his desk, a beautiful web of gold lines connecting thousands of stars. The gold lines representing the warp lanes were supposed to turn red around the Sol sector, isolating the human worlds. That is not what happened. The Sol sector went dark, but the darkness did not stop at the border. The red warning indicators cascaded outward like a virus, jumping from node to node, crossing imperial borders, skipping across the Zyrelian core worlds, the Vorenian agricultural hubs, and the outer rim defense perimeters. The trade routes were not just bypassing Earth, they were shutting down, all of them. The entire galactic economy, a machine of unimaginable complexity, was simply turning itself off. Which meant the grid wasn't failing, it was obeying a new set of orders. A low hum, then nothing. The lights in the grand chamber dimmed to a ghostly emergency red. Around the room, delegates began to shout, their translation earpieces failing, their tablets going dark. The automated planetary defense grids on a dozen core worlds simultaneously switched their operational status from active to maintenance mode. The realization hit Vale like physical trauma. Humans hadn't just built the ships and the stations, they had written the core routing architecture for the entire sector's communication and logistics network. They were the contractors. They were the engineers who had spent a century installing the backdoors and the kill switches while the council delegates were too busy debating the color of their ceremonial robes. The machines weren't broken. They were just no longer working for the council. Vale's terminal exploded with a final, desperate cascade of alerts as supply lines severed and targeting arrays went blind. The 12,000-year-old empire wasn't being attacked. It was being uninstalled. Down in the lower tier, the abandoned council badge sat on the black desk. The soft internal blue light flickered once, a tiny spark in the growing dark, and then died completely. The silence lasted for nearly an hour. In that hour, the atmosphere in the chamber grew heavy and warm. The scrubbers had died, and with them, the circulation of the thin, argon-heavy air. Delegates sat in the crimson gloom, looking at their dead screens, their bioluminescence fading as the reality of their situation began to settle in. They were the masters of the galaxy, and they were trapped in a dark room. Then the floor plates began to vibrate. It wasn't the rhythmic thud of a walker or the hum of a generator. It was a deep, subsonic vibration that made the sound-dampening stone walls scream. It was the sound of something massive moving through the atmosphere. Vale looked up at the transparent ceiling of the grand chamber. High above, the bruised plum sky was tearing open. A heavy thud, but this time it came from the sky. The human fleet had arrived. They didn't come in a single wave. They came in a cascade, dropping out of warp so close to the planet that the air ignited in streaks of orange fire. They were wedges of dark metal, brutal and scarred, their surfaces covered in the dust of deep space travel. They didn't fire. They didn't need to. They simply parked their massive hulls over the Xyrelian capital, blotting out the stars and the safety of the purple lattice. In the grand chamber, Prelate Morno finally managed to get his suit's backup power to cycle. He looked up at the ceiling, his helmet sensors flickering orange in the dark. They weren't in the Kaelan drift, he whispered. No, Vale said, his own voice sounding strange in the stagnant air. They were here, they've always been here. Vale looked down at the council badge. It was cold now, dead crystal. He thought about Marisol's walk out of the room. He thought about the grain of sand. He realized then that the desert wasn't coming for the machine. The desert was the machine. The emergency lighting in the grand chamber was not a steady glow. It was a rhythmic, frantic strobing of deep crimson that turned the obsidian walls into a series of jagged, blood-colored shadows. Without the hum of the atmospheric scrubbers, the silence was no longer a symbol of prestige. It was the silence of a tomb. The air began to stagnate almost instantly. The heavy argon, no longer churned by the ventilation fans, began to settle into the lower tiers like an invisible, suffocating fog. To Vale, every breath felt like a mouthful of silt. He clutched the edge of his desk, his copper scales glowing a frantic, staccato violet as his secondary optical ridges throbbed in the dimness. Around him, the accumulated wisdom of 12,000 years was collapsing into primal, uncoordinated noise. The high prelate of the Cathari was chirping in a high-pitched, warbling panic, a sound that echoed off the sound-dampening stone like a dying bird. A group of aquatic ambassadors from the Thalassic Union were hammering their tentacles against the reinforced glass of their hydration suits, their bioluminescent displays flashing a warning of low pressure as the internal regulators hissed and died. The Council's masters were discovering, for the first time in their long histories, that their power did not reside in their bloodlines or their ancient treaties. It resided in the software. It resided in the maintenance logs they had never bothered to read. In the center of the chaos, Prelate Morno was a swirling, violent storm of purple gas trapped within a gold-plated cage. The acoustic modulators in his suit were screeching, a raw, electronic feedback loop that sounded like a dying beast. He was tapping at his wrist-mounted terminal, his movements jagged and desperate. He looked up at the empty doors where Marisol had disappeared, his helmet sensors glowing a dull, flickering orange in the red gloom. Restore the primary node. Morno's voice finally managed to cut through the electronic screaming, though it was now thin and cracked. Guards, seize the envoy. She hasn't left the spire yet. Find her and bring her back in chains. If the grid is locked, we will use her blood to unlock it. But the guards did not move. Their kinetic dampening spears, miracles of ancient Xyrelian technology, were powered by the same quantum grid that had just been uninstalled. The heavy, gold-plated armor they wore, armor that was supposed to make them gods among the lesser species, was now nothing more than 60 kilograms of dead weight. They stood like statues, frozen by the very systems that were supposed to grant them strength. Their spears were just expensive sticks. Their armor was a sarcophagus. One guard attempted to take a step, his servos whining in a high-pitched protest before the joints locked entirely, sending him crashing to the obsidian floor with a deafening metallic clang. Which meant the locks were gone too. Vale looked at his terminal again. The red error text didn't change. It was a cold, binary statement of fact. The humans hadn't hacked the council. They hadn't planted a virus or deployed a logic bomb. They had simply logged out. They had withdrawn their participation, and in doing so, they had taken the foundation of the galaxy's infrastructure with them. Every transaction, every security handshake, every atmospheric adjustment in 1,000 systems was currently checking for a Terran administrative signature that was no longer there. Vale. Morno's voice boomed, manually amplified and distorted. You, scribe, why is your station still receiving a signal? Explain the status of the Blackwing fleet. Why haven't they mobilized? Vale jumped, his bioluminescence spiking to a blinding white. He looked down at his screen. His terminal was indeed flickering, but it wasn't the Council's gold-themed interface. It was a low-bandwidth, localized signal, bypassing the main grid entirely. A message was scrolling across the bottom in the blocky, utilitarian script of Earth. He tried to pull up the status of the Council's elite military response force, the Blackwing Fleet. Status: indefinite DOCKING lock. Reason: firmware license EXPIRED, renewal DNID. The realization hit Vale like physical trauma. The Xyrelians had bought their engines from Earth. They had bought their targeting computers from Earth. They had even bought the code that managed their life support from Earth. For a century, the Council had patted themselves on the back for their efficiency in outsourcing their manufacturing to the newcomers. They had called it a service contract. They had treated humanity like a convenient, low-cost labor force that built the toys the aristocrats played with. It turned out the humans called it a kill switch. A holographic projection shimmered into existence in the center of the chamber, right above the discarded Council badge. It was grainy, lacking the polished resolution of the Council's systems, but the image was unmistakable. It was Marisol. She wasn't fleeing. She wasn't hiding in a cargo hold. She was standing on the observation deck of the Council's own spire, her dark suit ruffled by the wind, the vast, lightless cityscape of Xyrel Prime visible behind her like a sprawling graveyard of glass and steel. Prelate, Marisol's voice filled the room, sounding strangely intimate in the echoing chaos. I noticed you were having some difficulty with your administrative permissions. I felt it was only fair to explain the situation before the air in your suit runs out. You see, the contract for the Orion Sector communication grid, the one my people built for you, included a standard non-hostility clause. Section 42, paragraph 9, it's very clear. Any attempt to enact unilateral economic or military sanctions against the provider results in immediate termination of service. You sabotaged us from the beginning. Morno screamed, his violet form pressing against the glass of his helmet. You planned this. You built a galaxy that only functions with your permission. We didn't sabotage anything, Marisol replied coolly. We just stopped working for free. When you dismissed Earth, you dismissed the engineers, the mechanics, the programmers, and the logisticians. You told us humanity was a single grain of sand. You forgot that a machine filled with sand eventually stops moving. You spent 12,000 years ruling through tradition. We spent 80 years ruling through infrastructure. One of those is much harder to ignore when the lights go out. The ground beneath the grand chamber groaned. It was a sound Vale had never heard before, the sound of tectonic plates being nudged by an impossible force. The argon in the room seemed to vibrate. On the projection behind Marisol, the bruised plum sky of Xyrel Prime was beginning to change. The shimmering lattice of the defense grid was fading. One by one, the glowing hexagonal nodes of the planetary shield were turning gray, then black. The ships you detected earlier, the decoys near the Kalen Drift, Marisol leaned closer to the camera. Those were just the ones we wanted you to find. The fleet we didn't want you to find, they've been here for months, Morno. Hiding in plain sight within the very grid you let us build for you. They've been parked in the hollowed-out hulls of the sensor buoys and the relay stations your taxes paid for. The projection cut to black, silence dead. A low, rhythmic thrumming began to rattle the obsidian walls, a sound so deep it was felt in the marrow of the bone rather than heard in the ear. It was the sound of space being folded and unfolded by engines that didn't care about the laws of the council. Vale looked up through the transparent ceiling of the grand chamber, his secondary eyes focusing on the thinning purple haze of the atmosphere. He saw the first wedge. It was a dark, jagged shape blotting out the stars of the Orion spur. Then another and another. They didn't arrive with the flash of light or the bang of a warp exit. They simply appeared as if they had been standing there for an eternity, waiting for the curtain to be pulled back. The ships were brutal. They were massive, unpainted slabs of hull plating and weapon batteries, their surfaces scarred by the dust of long-range voyages. They didn't have the elegant curves of the Xyrelian cruisers or the glowing bioluminescent accents of the Voranian barges. They looked like mountains that had been taught how to fly and how to kill. Hundreds of them were descending into the upper atmosphere, their massive thermal exhausts glowing a dull, angry orange. They were so large that the air itself began to scream as it was displaced, a high-pitched howling that echoed through the vents of the silent grand chamber. It was the sound of friction, of steel rubbing against the sky of a world that thought it was untouchable. Vale looked down at the desk in the lower tier. The council badge was still there. It sat in the red emergency light, a small, useless piece of crystal. A few minutes ago, it had been the most important object in Vale's universe. It had represented the summit of his career, the validation of his species, the light of civilization. Now it looked like a child's toy left in the path of a glacier. The human fleet did not fire. They didn't need to. They simply parked their massive hulls over the Xyrelian capital, blotting out the stars and the safety of the purple lattice. They took up positions over every major city, every orbital shipyard, every power plant. On the Voranian homeworld, a dozen Terran voidbreakers dropped out of warp directly above the central medical hub, their shadows plunging the clinics into darkness. Voranian high healer Krell stood up. He didn't look at Morno. He looked at the empty seat Marisol had left behind. He looked at the dead council badge. He reached for his own communication device, the only one still working, and sent a sector-wide broadcast on the human medical frequency. "This is the Voranian sovereignty." Krell's voice was broadcast not through the council's dead speakers, but through the emergency medical channels that every civilian ship still carried. "We recognize the Terran mandate's administrative authority. We will not engage, we will not support the council's sanctions. To all Voranian vessels, power down your weapons, open your lanes. The council's era is over. We would rather live in a human-managed future than die in a Xyrelian-managed past." It was the first domino. A previously hostile species, the Krull warlords, saw the Voranian surrender and the dark sky above Xyrel Prime. Their leaders were pragmatic. They realized that a species that could turn off your air and your trade without firing a shot was not a species you fought. You joined them, or you starved in the dark. The Krull heavy cruisers sitting in the orbital shipyards began to signal the arriving human fleet. They didn't signal a surrender, they signaled a change in management. They turned their guns away from the Terran voidbreakers and pointed them inward, toward the Xyrelian administrative towers. The desert had arrived. The blackout on Xyrel Prime was more than a power failure, it was a societal stroke. Outside the Grand Chamber, the millions of citizens who lived in the high spires were discovering the fragility of their existence. The gravlifts were dead, the environmental seals were leaking. People were trapped in transport pods hundreds of floors above the ground, looking out at a city that had been plunged into a darkness it hadn't known for 10 millennia. Which meant the humans hadn't just taken the grid, they had taken the trust. In the silence of the city, you could hear the screams, not of pain, but of sheer, unadulterated shock. The Xyrelian elite, a race that viewed themselves as the architects of destiny, were now crawling through service tunnels, their expensive gowns torn, their dignity evaporating in the stagnant heat. They looked to the sky for their fleet, for the Blackwings that were supposed to be their iron fist. But the Blackwings were nothing more than museum pieces, floating in their docks, their engines silent, their crews begging for a software update that would never come. And beneath the observation deck, the administrative heart of the Orion spur beat to a Terran rhythm, and the trade routes were not just bypassing Earth but were rewriting themselves to center upon it. And the old empires realized that they were not the masters of the machine but merely the passengers, and the silence that followed was not the silence of peace but the silence of a desert that had finally arrived to swallow the cities of the arrogant. The human fleet remained in the sky above Zyril Prime for 7 standard days without moving a single kilometer. They were silent sentinels, dark and immovable, casting long shadows that moved across the face of the planet like the hands of a clock. They didn't send boarding parties, they didn't demand tribute, they simply existed. In the grand chamber, the delegates had long since stopped shouting. They sat in the dim light, talking in hushed tones, their eyes constantly flitting toward the ceiling. The power had been restored, but it was different now. The lights were a softer, warmer hue. The air smelled of rain and ozone, a human preference that replaced the sterile, recycled scent of the old council. The gravity was no longer a crushing 12G, it had been dialed back to a gentle 10G, a setting that felt like a gift to Vale's aching joints. Vale stood at his desk, his fingers hovering over the new interface. The Zyrelian script was gone, replaced by a universal symbolic language designed by the Terran contractors. It was simpler, it was more efficient, it was also a reminder of who owned the keys. He looked down at the center tier. Marisol was gone, but her seat was not empty. The council badge sat exactly where she had left it. It was no longer glowing. The crystalline lattice had gone dark, the internal blue light extinguished the moment she had disconnected it from the terminal. Without the grid to power it, it was just a piece of carved stone. Vale walked down the stairs, his boots echoing in the quiet room. He reached the bottom tier and stood before the desk. He reached out, his copper-scaled hand trembling slightly, and picked up the disc. It was heavy, much heavier than it looked. He remembered how he had felt seeing her place it there. He had thought it was a gesture of defeat, a surrender of humanity's hard-won status. He had pitied her. He had pitied her species for their grain of sand arrogance. He realized now that she hadn't been surrendering. She had been discarding a shackle. The badge was not a symbol of inclusion. It was a tool of control, a physical anchor that kept a species tethered to the Council's rules and the Council's whims. By leaving it behind, she hadn't just walked away from a meeting, she had walked away from an entire way of life. She had traded a crystal ticket for a mountain of steel. Vale turned the crystal over in his hand. On the back, in tiny, almost invisible letters, was a manufacturing mark he had never noticed before. Made in Geneva, Earth. They hadn't just written the code, they had carved the symbols. They had built the very icons of the Council's authority and sold them to the galaxy at a premium. The ultimate irony was that the Council had been paying Earth for the privilege of being controlled by them. They had bought their own chains and called it diplomacy. Gone was the illusion of a galactic democracy. Vale looked at the badge, then at the massive dark ship still visible through the ceiling. He didn't feel like a victim. He felt like a student who had finally understood the lesson. The galaxy didn't belong to the loudest voice or the oldest name. It belonged to the ones who kept the lights on. He walked to the edge of the obsidian dais and placed the badge on the very edge of the desk. It was not a gesture of respect. It was a disposal. It was a piece of junk from a factory on a planet they had tried to starve, a physical lie that had finally been exposed. He left it there for the maintenance crews to find, a pebble left behind by a giant. As he walked out of the chamber, his footsteps were light, unburdened by the heavy gravity or the heavy lies of the old empire. He didn't look back at the dais or the empty high seats. The world outside was bright, the human ships were casting shadows that felt like shade rather than darkness, and for the first time in 12,000 years, the horizon was wide open. A single grain of sand was nothing, but the desert had arrived and it was beautiful. The dark ship above continued its silent orbit, a quiet mountain of steel watching over a galaxy that had just been uninstalled.